Hello, my name is Amy Glassmeyer, and I teach at MIT. I'm going to talk with you today about American poverty and living wages. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the history of poverty in the United States, describe some of the issues that are facing our country regarding the economic circumstances that many families find themselves in. I'll then talk about a tool that I built and I use to help people understand the cost of living in different communities. I'll review some data that we've developed on Westchester, and I'll conclude with some recommendations about what we can do when we're facing issues associated with the difficulty of making ends meet. Poverty in the United States has been measured since the early 1960s. It was historically concentrated in the U.S. South, and it still is concentrated in the U.S. South today, but the rate of poverty in the United States has fallen dramatically from more than 22% to around 12 to 14%. With 14 or 15% of the population in poverty, we have to ask the question, why are people still poor? And why is today a different time period with different circumstances than in the past? And what I would say to that is, this is an era of rising income inequality. We have the highest income inequality since before the Great Depression. We have stubbornly low wages, we have a lack of good jobs, and we have a loss of personal wealth due to a decline in home ownership. In addition, the wage gap between high and low skilled workers is significant, and for many Americans today, they have the fear of falling out of the middle class. It's important to start the story about why living wages matter by noting that income inequality has reached a level that is intolerable and is very difficult to change. In addition to, so some of the factors that are behind the fact that we have inequality of wages is the fact that labor force participation rates have been declining over time. And this is due to rising rates of female labor force participation, low quality jobs, and this has led to a situation in which thousands of Americans work 40 hours a week or more, and they don't make a living wage. In 2003, looking at the problem from a variety of perspectives, I built a tool called a living wage calculator. And what it allows you to do is to determine the cost of living in different locations. It was funded by the Ford Foundation. It was built for policymakers. And the whole idea was to try to help policymakers understand when communities have large job losses, what happens to the cost of living and what kinds of policies do we need to help people make adjustments. The tool consists of 7 major factors: housing costs, food costs, child care, health care, transportation, other necessities such as clothing, personal cleaning products, and miscellaneous, and taxes. And the tool is basically built using conventional data that's primarily captured by local governments and the state governments. We calculate the data, we accumulate new data every year, and we post it just about this time. We should actually have new data up by Friday. So what does it mean when we say we have a living wage calculator? What does it tell us? So let's begin by thinking first about the minimum wage. That's something that you know pretty well. And you know that the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and you also probably know that it hasn't changed since 2009. It doesn't change because it's a change that would have to take place in the Office of Management and Budget, and no president wants to raise wages while they're in office. What does it mean to have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour? It means that about 97% of Americans, if they all were living on the minimum wage, wouldn't be able to make it, because Americans living in counties where the living wage is higher than the minimum wage is about 97%. Americans living in counties where living wages are at least $2.50 higher than the minimum wage is about 70% of the population. Americans living in counties where living wages are at least $5 higher than the minimum wage is about 47 million people. And Americans living in counties where living wages are at least $15 per hour, that accounts for about 38% of 38 million people. So the bottom line is that you can't live on a living wage or minimum wage in the United States. Another issue that comes up with the fact that we have problems with the wage rate is that it makes people feel insecure. And we have all thought of ourselves primarily as achieving or attempting to achieve an opportunity to be in the middle class. And the middle class is increasingly out of reach for more Americans. So back in the 1970s, about 61% of Americans were in the middle class, and today the number is only 52%. And in addition to wanting to be in the middle wage, wanted to be in the middle class, we also had this expectation that our children would do better than us and they would be able to be in income brackets that were larger than ours. And that has increasingly declined over time. Across the US, making it in the middle class does not even guarantee the security of a living wage. It's $12,745 average difference between the living wage and the minimum household income, which is required for individual to reach middle class income status in 260 of the US metropolitan areas. So the bottom line is that people would need to make an additional $12,000 in order to be in the middle class, given the fact that income inequality has grown so much. So let's take a look at New York. So we calculated some data looking at Westchester households, and we wanted to see what the cost was to support different sized families. And we see that it takes about $28,000 for a single person to cover their basic costs in Westchester County. For a household of a single parent and one child, it's about $56,000, all the way up to 2 adults and 1 child, which is $50,000 per person in the household. So you know very well what the income capability is of folks in your community. So how does that match with what you know? So minimum wage is not enough for most households in Westchester County. The only category of working adults where the minimum wage is capable of covering their basic costs are 2 adults with both working and no children. Other than that, 1 adult and 2 adults with 1 working and also with children do not make enough money on the state hourly wage to cover their costs. We also looked at some additional counties in New York to make some comparisons, and we looked at Westchester, Nassau, the Bronx, Erie, Onondaga, Broome, and Albany. And what we can see here is that the color scheme means the following. From green, the minimum wage in New York is greater than the living wage by $1, and it's dark green is $1, and light green, the minimum wage is higher than the living wage. What we see with the orange color is that the living wage is higher than the minimum wage, so that's light, and then the living wage is greater than the minimum wage by $3, that's darker orange, and then the living wage is darkest, greater than the minimum wage by $10. And what you can see is that for the most part, with the exception of 2 adult household with no children, the majority of households do not make a living wage that it would take the state's minimum wage would not cover their costs of living. Some other relevant statistics are to think about the places where the gaps between between the living wage and the minimum wage are highest, and they tend to be in fast-growing cities, and a lot of cities that are in the sort of upper South, cities in California, Maryland, and New Jersey. And these are places that are high-cost locations, and consequently they require a higher living wage. And then finally, in terms of some metro areas where the more than half of the households struggle to cover their basic costs, there's more than 25 metro areas where the living wage is greater than the median household income. And these are places like Los Angeles, Fresno, Eugene, Oregon, New York City, Miami. So there's many places in the United States where the minimum wage doesn't come close to covering household needs, and the gaps are very significant in many places around the country. So what do we do about that? Well, the bottom line is that what we want to do is we want to be able to attract businesses that pay living wages, or we want to encourage businesses that live in our communities to pay living wages. And already we're seeing that many places around the country are attempting to do just that. So 29 states plus the District of Columbia and nearly 24 cities and counties have set their own higher minimum wages. State hourly minimum wages range from $7.50 in New Mexico to $11.50 in DC, and states like New York are moving toward even higher minimum wages than that. Together, these states include about 61% of the nation's working age population. So places where people are living, it's becoming very clear that people cannot live on the minimum wage, and states and communities are taking it into their own hands to try to raise wages for people to be able to get by. Among the cities that have enacted even higher local minimums are San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, San Diego, and ultimately New York City will fall into that category. So that's one of the most important things that we can do, is to really work with our employers to encourage them to pay living wages. And part of the whole story of paying living wages is that they have to be willing to train their employees to be more productive. That's what makes it possible for employers to pay higher wages than they might be able to do otherwise. So in conclusion, we're in a period of significant economic change. Work doesn't pay, minimum wages don't cover costs, child care and housing are the most important expenses, and those are out of the control of most individuals. That we have big ranges of wage rates across the country, and that it's really up to us and communities to make a difference by encouraging employers to pay living wages, in particular encouraging the public sector to pay living wages, because that's not mobile employment. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day together.